Acheron is a strange character. She is a character who is so forgetful that she doesn't even remember the room that she's in. There is no scarcity of topics to discuss when it comes to Acheron. We could talk about her red text, the origin of her powers, or the topic for today's discussion, who is the Aeon that she is an emanator of. Towards the end of the 2.0 questline, Avengerine tells us outright that Acheron is the emanator of an Aeon that brings finality and destruction wherever she goes. And while that is all fine and good, there is but one problem, and that is the fact that Avengerine never explicitly stated who she was an emanator of, and that is what I'm here to discuss today. So without further ado, let's go ahead and start discussing. As of now, Honkai StarRail has a grand total of 18 Aeons that exist in the world, and we have to figure out which one of these most closely resonates with Acheron. We could take a random shot in the dark right now and have a 1 in 18 chance of being correct, but even though I'm a gacha player, I don't exactly like those odds. So the first step in figuring out who she is going to be to narrow this list down a little. So in order to do that, we're going to compare and contrast the powers and personality of Acheron and all the Aeons, and hopefully by measuring that up in comparison with what we've seen from previous emanators, we'll be able to find a more concrete answer. From what we know about Acheron, she is a skilled fighter, a little bit airheaded, and doesn't necessarily seem to care about anything going on around her. She doesn't have any overtly clear goals, but definitely seems to have some sort of ulterior motive. Now that's admittedly not very much to go off of and tells us almost nothing, so let's just go ahead and start marking off some of these Aeons. Starting things off on Easy Street, we need to figure out who's dead and who's not, because in order to be an emanator, your powers have to be coming from somewhere. And to that end, we can immediately check off the beauty, the permanence, the order, and the propagation. And following up very closely behind them, Akavili the Trailblaze is also assumed dead because she's been missing for God knows how long. So we're gonna go ahead and mark her off as well, which leaves us with a grand total of 13 Aeons to choose from. Now this is the part where I actually have to start doing my job as a story YouTuber and start telling you why some of these wouldn't work. The Elation is a relatively easy one to check off. Acheron doesn't demonstrate any party animal-esque traits, nor does she have any of the powers and abilities we've come to associate with members of the Masked Fools. And in a similar vein to this, Remembrance doesn't seem very likely either, because people who usually end up following this path have some heavy hand in the idea of memories. And Acheron, a character with chronic memory loss, doesn't fit this description at all. Preservation is one that's harder to mark off, but in the event that you actually look into the text of the game, it's pretty obvious that's not what it is. For those who are unaware, the Aeon associated with preservation is usually in the same ballpark of the IPC, and the IPC does not have any documents on Acheron. And if this ends up being the case, well then they probably don't associate. Usually this sort of rationale would be somewhat flimsy, but in the case of the preservation specifically, the ICP is actively trying to prevent information on it from getting out, so if they don't know who it's associating with, then they probably aren't associating with it. Now I'm gonna go through these next two pretty quickly because they're relatively similar rationale, and that is both the harmony and the abundance. According to Avengerine's words specifically, Acheron brings death and finality wherever she goes. People blessed by the harmony, at least from what we've seen, don't necessarily have any offensive capabilities, so that wouldn't make any sense, and the abundance are explicitly stated to be damn near immortal. And this immortality goes to such a heavy extent that people are more likely to go fucking crazy before they die. So these two just don't seem that likely. And finally, of the easier ones to mark off, we have Norris the Erudition, which is the one associated with the Genius Society. Considering that there are only 123 members of the Genius Society and Acheron is dumber than a pile of hammers, yeah, no, she definitely ain't getting into that one. And all of that being said, that only leaves us with 7 Aeons left. The Hunt, the Finality, the Equilibrium, the Nihility, the Veracity, the Destruction, and the Enigmatic. And this is where it starts to get difficult, because the information that we have about these Aeons is either so scarce that we can't necessarily get any leads, or it's so abundant that congratulations, we now have several. But I do still think there is a clearer answer on the horizon, so I'm going to continue getting rid of some of these. I don't think it's Mythia / the Enigmatic, because that's entire thing's purpose is getting rid of Norris. I also don't really foresee it being Veracity, because yeah, while Acheron does bring death and finality wherever she goes, that doesn't necessarily line up. The Hunt is a harder one, but I don't think it's that likely, because the Lofu also associates with the Hunt. They have trade routes going to 9 different places and contend with the IPC, yet the IPC doesn't know about Acheron. The Hunt also has the Galaxy Rangers, which some people might point to, but notice how in the drip marketing it doesn't say she is one, it says that she claims to be one. And that's a bit of an odd choice in words, because more often than not when we get drip marketing, it explicitly states what their title is. And that, my friend, only leaves us with with 4 remaining: the finality, the equilibrium, the nihility, and destruction. So is there any proof of Acheron being any of these 4? The equilibrium, we do not know anything about. We know vaguely what he does, and that's pretty much it. And we cannot reliably cross him off because what we see from Acheron does not go against what little we know about him. Next up is the finality, and probably I'd say the second most likely and the one that I think is the most interesting. In order to understand the finality, you have to understand Honkai Impact 3rd, because allegedly there was a Aeon known as the Cocoon, which was created some point during that story, and the way that it's worded and the way that it's symbolized is remarkably similar to the finality in Honkai StarRail. The person who wrote Honkai Impact 3rd is the same person who's writing this section of Penacony, and one of the very last things that the Cocoon saw was Raiden Mei. And since the Aeon of Finality doesn't even have a picture associated with it, much less a log in Simulated Universe, we can't say for sure that this upcoming Acheron is not an emanator of it. Also, Avengerine's phrasing regarding Acheron makes it seem even more likely, because he describes her as somebody who shows up whenever, who associates with death and finality, and has no information regarding her. But despite everything I said, it's hard to justify because we don't fucking know anything about the finality, and it's all circumstantial evidence anyway. And everything, all of it, the last 8 minutes of narrowing things down all lead us up to this moment: the destruction and the nihility. And of these 2 Aeons, the one that I believe Acheron most closely associates with is the nihility. Everything that I just said in this video thus far is circumstantial evidence. It's a narrowing down of possibilities, not necessarily direct or concrete in any way, shape, or form. In theory, I just got to the same answer, but with a more solid foundation. So now, I'm gonna build up on it. For those who don't know, the nihility path is nihilism. It is the idea that nothing in life matters, and Acheron seems to somewhat emulate that. She's a talented fighter and is skilled in her own right, but doesn't necessarily have any drive to do anything. At least in what we've seen of her, she's relatively directionless and doesn't really know what she's doing unless it directly involves somebody else. But even then, she can't be bothered to remember faces and is relatively apathetic even to the people she ends up helping. And supporting this theory is actually the new relic set, otherwise known as the Diver of Dead Waters. Now in Acheron's drip marketing, we see a whole bunch of red flowers in a field behind her, and if we take a look at this relic set, we can see something similar here, with each of these having some form of red flower implanted on the item. Additionally, the descriptions on all of these items seem somewhat symbolic of the idea that nothing in life matters. And hell, even staying in line with teasers and hints we're getting from the teaser image, we see that Acheron is associated with the nihility path. Oh, and by the way, IX is a being who is so powerful that just being in a close proximity to it means you will get forcibly removed from the situation. In Simulated Universe, when you encounter IX, your run is ended early regardless of where you are and how long you've been playing. And we even got to see Acheron do something like this, because the second we started getting too close, she took us out and dragged us back to the waking world. But she didn't do it with some form of tactfulness. She did it by actively killing us in one blow. And while we're on the topic of Simulated Universe, going back to that data entry revolving 9, you'll notice that it details an instance where the Annihilation Gang attempted to take the life of the Aeon. Of course, they ended up failing miserably, but one thing that you probably picked up on was the idea of the Annihilation Gang. Because as we've all come to know from the story's controversy, the Annihilation Gang is currently in shambles thanks to none other than Acheron, who just showed up one day and killed Duke Infernum. And if we're assuming that Acheron is the Emanator of 9, well, all of a sudden it's starting to make sense why she's suddenly up and off to them. Now, some of you may say that the stuff in Simulated Universe is hearsay conjecture and didn't actually happen, but we got clear evidence in this update that it did. One time, the Aeon of Elation, AHA, blew up an entire planet in half the Trailblaze Express, and in the Penacony 2.0 update, there is an instance that happens in the main story where we see these details recounted word per word. So the shit that happens in Simulated Universe actually happened in Honkai StarRail lore, so you can't use that argument anymore. And finally, in the White Knight trailer, shortly after Firefly turning to dust, we see Acheron standing in front of a black hole and shedding a tear, and the Aeon of IX is personified as none other than a sad black hole. Compared to the nothing of equilibrium, the nothing of veracity, the circumstantial of hunt and destruction and the hearsay of the finality, I believe that the most likely Aeon that Acheron is an emanator of is the Nihility, and the evidence of all the other 5 combined doesn't even stand in contender with just the evidence of the Nihility. I hope you enjoyed the video, like and subscribe if you want more, and until then, I'm out.